Miles has given me the easy task of, in 20 minutes, trying to explain the complexities of penalty enforcement. So I don't propose to do that because it's not possible, but what I do hope to do in the next 20 minutes is to give you some insights into what you as a referee should be thinking about when you have to deal with a penalty. So I tend to think of it as a three-step process. The first thing I want to think about is to assess the information that I'm going to need. The second thing is to then think about what the potential options might be and what the enforcements are going to be. And then the third step is going to be signals and announcements. So the important thing throughout this entire process is to have a system so that you're always doing things the same way, and that way you will get into a routine and these things will become second nature to you, and you won't sort of stumble and pause and these sorts of things as you're going along. So if we think about the first point, getting the information. So as a referee, once we're aware that a penalty has occurred, we need to find out certain things. And the very first thing I contend that we need to know is, what was the result of the play? Before I want to know anything about the penalty, I want to know what the result of the play was. Was it a touchdown? Was it an incomplete pass? Was it a turnover? Tell me what happened on the play, because that is my starting point. Because then that will drive what potential options might be, who I might be speaking to in terms of offering the options, and more importantly, it might dictate where the enforcement is going to be. So I want to know the result of the play first and foremost. Then, as BC mentioned, I don't want a story from the calling official. I just want the facts. I need to know what was the foul, who committed it, and that can be team, player, ideally both, where the foul occurred, and hopefully where is marked by your flag. And it's not that I don't trust you, but I want to be absolutely sure. I'm going to say to you, is your flag at the spot of the foul? If it's a foul that requires a spot, there are a lot of line of scrimmage fouls don't require spots, for example. But if it's one that requires a spot, such as pass interference potentially, or holding, block in the back, I'm going to ask you, is your flag at the spot of the foul? I'm expecting it to be, because even if it wasn't when you threw it, I'm expecting that you would have moved it to the spot before you came to me to report. But I'm not going to assume, I'm going to check, and I'm going to say, is your flag at the spot of the foul? And if you say no, I'm going to go and ask you to move it, so we know, everybody can see where the spot of the foul is, because it makes it so much easier to sell the call when we're then enforcing from a particular spot. And the other very important thing I may need to know is, when did that foul occur? Did it occur during the pass, during the kick, while the ball was loose, after the change of possession, after the ball was dead? So the when is as important as any of those other factors. If it's just a straightforward run play that gained 3 yards from a cloud of dust, really doesn't matter. It's going to either occur during the run or after the play is over. So those are the critical pieces of information that I need to know. Now, we may have more than one foul on the play. If we have multiple fouls, try and get into a situation where you establish the order of those fouls and get that information in the order in which they occurred. It makes it so much easier when you're considering the options and when you're announcing the penalties. Everything follows sequentially. Get the order of the fouls. If you have more than one official who has a flag for the same foul, it's important that they talk to each other before coming to see you. They should be conferring what they've got. Do they have 2 separate fouls, or do they have the same thing? If they have the same thing, only one of those officials should come to report to you, or give you they can give you the visual signal if they like. And that way I know that both officials have the same foul, and I don't have to talk to both officials. And your umpire, and if you're working with a centre judge, your centre judge should also be involved in those discussions because it acts as a nice safety check for you that we're all agreed on exactly what we've got. We all know what happened, who did what, where, and when to whom, and that will make penalty enforcement so much easier. It means we've got a much better chance of getting it right. So having gained all that information, we've then got to think about what our options are, and we have to think about enforcements. And this is the part that people love, all of this stuff about enforcements. So we want to think about how many yards is this penalty going to be? And whilst ultimately we can all learn it, if you're not sure, if you really can't remember or you're not sure, there's a pretty simple way of remembering, and you'll be right 90+% of the time. Can everybody see that screen? Yep, good, thank you.
Yep.
So penalties, whilst we know there are some penalties that don't have yardage attached, they might just be a loss of down. All penalties are going to be 5, 10 or 15 yards. Now, I know somebody's going to throw in the exception and say, well, what about a defensive pass interference that's only 8 yards downfield? But generally speaking, the standard penalty is either 5, 10 or 15 yards. And you can think about it this way if you're not sure. Is it a minor procedural foul? If it is, it'll be 5 yards. Is it a personal foul or an unsportsmanlike conduct or a pass interference or a kick-catch interference? If it is, that's what you could refer to as a major foul. That's 15 yards. Everything else is 10. And there's only 5 10s anyway. Holding, illegal use of hands, illegal block, illegal batting, and illegal kicking. So if you can remember those 5 10-yard penalties, then you've got everything else sussed. It's either 5 or 15, and you've got a better than even chance of figuring out which one it is, I would suggest. And we know there are other things that may be attached with penalties. There may be an automatic first down. If it's a personal or unsportsmanlike conduct foul by the defence, it's a defensive pass interference. If it's holding, defensive holding against an eligible receiver during a pass play, these all come with automatic first downs. So there is no substitute for knowing the rule, the yardage and the penalty. But if you ever get stuck, this is a quick, simple way of remembering. You'll be pretty right. And as I think Miles mentioned in his opening statements, that the truth of the matter is nobody else is likely to know anyway. The coaches and players are unlikely to know. If your crew know, they'll help you out. And if they don't know, then nobody's any the wiser. And they'll all be happy to go along with whatever you say. So to look at enforcing penalties, we have to consider the types of penalties. Are they going to be live ball? Are they going to be dead ball? Are they going to be a combination? Are we going to have multiple fouls, or is it going to be a simple foul? Now, what you can see there, and I'm assuming Miles, well, this is being recorded anyway, but I'm assuming Miles might share this afterwards anyway. So there are 3 penalty modules listed there, which we have created. And some of the material we'll be talking about tonight is contained in those modules. Some of the slides I'm showing are contained in those modules. So they're just going through a final stage of auditing, if you will, at the moment, with the changes we've made this year. So I'm sure Miles will let everybody know once they're actually posted up to the training academy. And I would encourage every referee to study those 3 particular modules, because hopefully the way we've constructed those slides will help everybody understand the basic principles of penalty enforcement. The 3-in-1 principle, I'm sure many of you have heard of that, and hopefully you all have at least some idea of what it means. And some of the trickier enforcement to do with PSK, or post-scrimmage kick enforcement, to give it its full name. Enforcement for fouls involving the goal line, and enforcement for fouls where scores are concerned. So before I talk about fouls themselves, I just want to talk a little bit about some other basic principles which sometimes we forget. And the first of those is that any penalty can be declined. So even a dead ball foul can be declined, a false start can be declined, a dead ball personal foul can be declined. I don't know why you'd want to, but I can understand why you might want to decline a false start, for example. You might not want to give the punter an extra 5 yards of punting space if he's trying to nail you inside your own 10-yard line or something like that. So any penalty can be declined, doesn't matter if it's a live ball or a dead ball. The second important thing to understand is that any penalty that occurs during a play in which there is an inadvertent whistle can be enforced. The fact that there's an inadvertent whistle doesn't negate the penalty. The option is still there for the offended team to accept or decline a penalty, even though what we're going to do in terms of replaying the down or the team taking the ball where it was whistled dead, even though that may take precedence, a penalty can still be enforced on top of that. So that's an important thing to remember. Something else that sometimes people get a bit confused over when they're first starting out with penalty enforcement is that sometimes we get into what's called a half-distance enforcement procedure. So when we're close to a goal line going in, we get a major penalty, 15-yard penalty, or even a 10-yard penalty. And we're only able to enforce it half the distance. Now, that means we can only enforce half the distance to the goal line. It doesn't mean we can only enforce half the penalty. So if we're on the B18 and we get a defensive holding penalty, we're inside the 20, so it's more, 10 yards is more than half the distance. So we can only go from the 18 to the 9. We assess 9 of those 10 yards. It doesn't mean we can only assess 5 of those 10 yards. So that's something that sometimes causes a bit of confusion for people. And before I start talking about enforcement spots, the other thing to remember is that a lot of penalties have an enforcement spot specified in the statement of penalties. So it may say that this particular penalty is enforced from the previous spot or the succeeding spot. That's important we know what that means and where those spots are, but it simply means that it makes life easier in terms of enforcement, because then we don't have to figure out where the enforcement spot is based upon the basic principles and the 3-in-1 principle, which we're going to talk about shortly. And then we have to look at whether it's a simple foul, a single foul, whether we have multiple live ball fouls. And again, do we have multiple live ball fouls by the same team, or do we have multiple live ball fouls by both teams? The same applies to dead ball fouls. We could have a combination of live and dead ball fouls, either by the same team or by both teams. So there are a lot of scenarios that can govern the principles that we have to apply when enforcing penalties. I don't have the time, and it's not the place to go into all of those right now. This is something that requires you to study these. I'm just trying to give you a few tips and guidelines to move things along quickly when you're in a game situation, because we don't want to be holding the game up while we have a 5-minute discussion about whether it's enforced from this spot or that spot. And we've all been there and done that. Well, I certainly have anyway. So let's talk about the enforcement spot. So as the name implies, this is the spot from where penalty, if accepted, will be enforced. So sometimes it's stated where that enforcement spot is. It might be the previous spot. Otherwise, it becomes related to the basic spot, and it's governed by the 3-in-1 principle. So the potential enforcement spots are listed there on the screen. There's really 4 of them, and there's a 5th one if we get into a scrimmage kick play, is what's called the post-scrimmage kick spot. So it can really, a penalty can only really be enforced from one of those spots. Which one is the $64 million question? And that's what we have to try and get our heads around. Now, the basic spot, you'll come across this when you read Rule 10.2 about penalty enforcements. The basic spot is simply a term for the benchmark for the enforcement spot. And the rulebook talks about the basic spot on 4 types of plays. Running plays, and the basic spot on running plays will change based upon what type of run it is, where the run ends, whether we've got a neutral zone, those type of things. The basic spot on pass plays, it's simple. It's always the previous spot. And on kick plays, the basic spot is always the previous spot, unless post-scrimmage kick enforcement rules come into play. And we will cover those. Now, having said that, as with everything in the rule book, there are exceptions. And when we talk about the basic spots in the 3-and-1 principle, as we'll see on the next slide, we have to think about those exceptions. So the 3-and-1 principle very simply says when the penalty is not stated, when the spot is not stated in the penalty statement, then we revert to these 4 principles. If the team in possession fouls behind the basic spot, then we enforce the penalty at the spot of the foul, exception, which I'll talk about in a second. When the team in possession commits a foul beyond the basic spot, the penalty is enforced at the basic spot. And when the team not in possession, the opposition commits a foul either behind or beyond the basic spot, the penalty is enforced at the basic spot. Now, what does all that mean in plain English? It's not an easy concept to understand. So there are 4 possible foul scenarios. The offense foul behind the basic spot or beyond the basic spot, or the defense foul behind the basic spot or beyond the basic spot. And so that little table just encapsulates and summarizes that 3 of those scenarios, the foul is enforced from the basic spot. And in the 4th situation, it's from the spot of the foul with what are called the hippie exceptions. And the hippie exceptions refer to holding, illegal use of hands, personal foul, and illegal blocks. So if the offence hold, commit illegal use of hands, commit an illegal block, or commit a personal foul behind the basic spot, then the spot of the foul is not the enforcement spot, if everybody's totally confused. So Miles put together this rather nice diagram, which sort of gives you a visual illustration of what we're trying to say. You figure out who's fouled and where they've fouled in relation to the basic spot. Because once we understand where the foul occurs in relation to the basic spot, we can then establish where the enforcement spot is going to be. Except for April. And then the exception becomes post-scrimmage kick enforcement. Now again, another nice little diagram to visually illustrate it. It's been put together by Miles. So there's a time span during a play when post-scrimmage kick enforcement rules can apply. And in essence, this says that when the play ends, if the receiving team is in possession of the ball and certain other things hold true, then they can keep the ball but be assessed for their foul, so that we don't have to go back and have a re-kick and assess a penalty against Team B. Team B can keep the ball because it occurred during this interval, or during the PSK window, from the time the ball was kicked until the kick ended. And as I hope we all know, the kick ends when the receiving team possess it, not when they touch it, when they possess it. So the play doesn't necessarily end when the receiving team possess it, but that's when the post-scrimmage kick window closes, because after that, we're now into a running phase. So having briefly addressed those principles, I then want to move on to the next point about expediting penalty enforcement. So we want the umpire to be getting out the offended captain. So we've got the information we need from the calling officials. The referee and the umpire know what they're going to do in terms of giving an option and getting an enforcement. So we want the umpire to be getting the offended captain ready for the referee to give him those options. And what we want to try and do is give them simple choices. Don't baffle them with science. People like simple choices. If the enforcement is obvious, it's a no-brainer, just tell them what you're going to do. If they're not happy about it, they'll soon let you know. But explain things to them in a way that they can understand and give them the most obvious option first. And you can couch it in the way of, do you want to keep the ball? And if they say yes, then, well, okay, if you want to keep the ball, we're going to decline team A's foul, but we're going to enforce your foul. And they'll probably be quite happy with that, because the alternative was to replay the down and give the ball back to the other team. So try and use simple terminology when you're explaining things to captains. Give them simple choices. And whilst the umpire is getting the offended captain, the referee should be giving a preliminary signal, providing it's a live ball foul. For a dead ball foul, it's not necessary to give a preliminary signal. You just get the option, make your signal and announcement. But for a live ball foul, give a preliminary signal so both teams, both sidelines know what the call is, and they can be thinking about what they're going to do. Do they want to accept or decline the penalty? And the other team can be thinking about, well, if they accept the penalty, what are we going to do defensively or offensively on the next play? So early information to the coaches is important, and we need to do that before we have discussions with the captain. We should not be having discussions with people on the field when the people on the sideline still don't know what the foul is. Make sure we take care of that first. When you do give a signal, it's important that you find a clear space to stand in so that nobody's going to walk across your path, and people on both sides of the field hopefully can see you, but certainly the offended team coach can see you, because it may be the coach who's going to make that decision for his captain. And stand still. Get yourself a solid base, because your signals look a lot better that way, and you look more assured when you're stood still. If you signal and talk while you walk, it looks like you're all over the shop and you're not really confident in what you're doing. Make sure you know what you're going to say. And as I mentioned before, present the fouls in the order in which they occurred. Don't, if you've got two fouls and only one of them is going to be accepted, obviously, if they're live ball fouls, don't just ignore the first one. You've still got to process it. We have holding offence, that penalty is declined. We have pass interference offence, that penalty is accepted. And speak slowly so that you can be heard and understood. And if you haven't got a microphone, speak in a loud voice, particularly if it's a windy day. You may not normally speak in a loud voice, but it goes with being a referee that you need to project. You need to project confidence. You need to project the fact that you're sure about what you're doing and you're confident in what you're doing. And make your signals slow and sure, make them crisp and make them big. Don't rush them. Let everybody be under no misapprehension about what you're signaling. Again, it inspires confidence in you, because it shows you're confident in your signals, you're confident in your announcement. You may not be, but it's all about making everybody else believe that you are. And by way of demonstration, I just want to finish off by showing you a play where I think the referee does a terrific job with his composure and his announcement. You can see this play, yeah?
Going to get her against the Chiefs, if I understand how this rule works.
Just run this one.
Right to the snap. Offside, number 17 in the defence. 5-yard penalty, first down.
I think that's an excellent work by the referee. He stood still, signals were received, announcement was excellent.
Was there meant to be video with that, Paul? We just heard the audio.
Oh, you couldn't see the video?
I think you need
We're still on your other screen.
I think you need to stop sharing and then reshare again on the screen you want.
My apologies. All right. Let me try that again. So much for that great idea. Now I seem to have lost my Zoom screen totally. Right, Miles, do you want to take it back for a minute, and I'll have to try and get my Zoom screen back up, and I'll run that play and we can perhaps show it at the end.
Yeah, technology can be wonderful at times.
Yes, my apologies for that. One more thing I wanted to say was that when you finished with your penalty process, once all of that's done, the very next thing you should be doing is setting the play clock to 25 seconds, ready for the next play, and declaring the ball ready for play, and if appropriate, winding the clock based upon what the previous play was. So it's important you do those things in the order. Don't declare the ball ready for play, then start the play clock, because the play clock should be starting when you declare the ball ready for play. So get your order right. And if you've got the official who's running the game clock, if they are worth their salt, get them to help you out, as BC mentioned before, by prompting you as to whether the clock starts on the ready or the snap, because you've got a lot of things to think about while you're doing penalty enforcement, and you might need to be reminded about what the previous play was as to whether we're going on the ready or the snap. Any questions?
Do we have any questions for Paul, please? You baffled them with the mechanics of the of enforcement, mate.
Yes, I know. So
I'll ask one, Paul. Particularly for, say, deep fouls, deep wings, got pass interference or whatnot down the end. How do you generally approach it as a referee? Do you go halfway to them? Do you make them come all the way to you? What's your general approach for communications with officials that are a fair distance away to make a call to get their information for penalty enforcement?
That's a very good question, Greg. And the answer is two parts, I suppose. If you have radios, obviously that's a lot easier. And I always encourage officials, when it's a straightforward foul, in other words, a foul that everybody can see and everybody expects, I'm more than happy for the calling official to give me a visual, to give me the visual signal anyway, if he knows what the signal for that foul is. But I certainly encourage the referee and the calling official to meet halfway. I expect both of them to hustle and meet. There's nothing worse than a penalty that's occurred 20 yards downfield and one official takes his time walking to the other one, or they both slowly walk towards each other. We should hustle, meet halfway, and let's expedite the process.
So would you then go, as a referee, you've got your decision from that official, would you then go back to roughly your same position for your announcement? Would you just try and find a space where you are to make the announcement? How would you generally do the announcement then? Because obviously if you're meeting halfway, you're probably going to be in amongst players, or you'll have the line of scrimmage somewhere in amongst you.
Yep. So the important thing is to find a space where you can be seen, hopefully by both sides, but certainly by the offended team's sideline. And if that means you have to come back to the middle of the field because that's where we're going to be enforcing the penalty from, perhaps, then that's fine. It's a case of doing what you need to do to ensure that you can be seen and heard and expedite the penalty as quickly as possible.
On that
hey, Paul, sorry, I've got one. I've got a question, Alec, here.
Sure.
Okay. Go, Alec.
Hey, Paul. So, Paul, is the 3-in-1 principle the basic paradigm to use on the field like 90% of the time? Give me your thoughts on that.
It's the basic paradigm 100% of the time when the penalty statement doesn't tell you what the enforcement spot is. So if the penalty clause in the rule book doesn't tell you that it's a 5-yard penalty from the previous spot, or a 5-yard penalty from the succeeding spot, or it's enforced at the spot of the foul, then by default you go to the 3-in-1 principle and start to work your way through that process to determine where the enforcement spot is. And that will be governed by what type of play it was and where the foul occurred in relation to the end of that play.
So following on from that, the catch that you'll find is that once you've worked out what the 3-in-1 is all about, is that you get caught out by a foul that actually had a statement of a spot in its penalty.
Yeah.
And so don't forget to pay attention to those when you're reading the foul. You say, oh, it's a 5-yard penalty. No, it's a 5-yard penalty from the spot of the foul. Make sure you know that.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Sean. So, and I've been guilty of that myself. And I've sort of looked at something and I said, yeah, it's a 5-yard penalty. And then when it happens to me on the field, I'm thinking, ooh, was that from the spot of the foul or is that from the previous spot? And if I haven't really boned up on that properly, I'm going to get caught out. And the last thing I'll say on penalty enforcement is that if all else fails, and again, this harkens back to something that Miles said, do what seems right and logical and sensible to you, and you can't go too far wrong.
And if you do it confidently,
yes,
coaches won't question you as much as if you're out there going, not sure.
Absolutely. You can be the worst official in the world as far as your rules knowledge is concerned, and as long as you project confidently, then everyone will believe you. And you could be the most knowledgeable rulebook official in the world. If you look hesitant and uncertain on the field, players and coaches will sense blood.
That's a nice segue, Paul, onto the next topic.
Just be aware that Paul Mercer will catch you out on that. So, confidence isn't the only answer.
Well, okay. That's it. That's the advantage of COVID is you can't travel anywhere at the moment, so we're fine.
Okay.
There is still live streaming of games, Greg.
Yes, I know.
At that point, I'm going to shut Paul down.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for walking us through through penalty enforcement.
And just to add that if anybody has any questions at any time about penalties and rules and enforcements, I'm more than happy to talk at any time outside of this meeting or any other meeting. I'm always happy to talk rules.
Okay. Yeah, we know that. Right, my third session, having said thank you to Paul for talking us through penalty enforcement. It is a complex subject, and as he said, that barely scratches the surface, but it's enough that you've kind of got to go, yeah,